better understanding the set of revolutions that began in 2011 and all around the Arab world. In these terms, I want to thank Peter Bartu for being here with us, and more taking into account the time gap that is dividing us, 9 hours. For those who don't know him, Peter is a lecturer in the University of California, Berkeley. He's specialized in the Middle East and in the structure of international organizations. Peter has also worked as a foreign policy advisor in the Australian Prime Minister Department, and apart from that, he has worked with the UN in Cambodia in 1991-1993, East Timor 1999, Iraq 2008-2009, and in the Middle East peace process. In 2011, he was a member of the UN mediation team during the Libyan revolution, the topic in which we'll focus today. Welcome, Peter, and please feel free to add or correct me in whatever I just said.
Thanks, Diego, and welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to be able to join you today, and very topical, of course, in the context of the current catastrophe in the east of the country, around Derna, Susa, and Beda, where many people have lost their lives in dreadful circumstances. And I've been in touch with a number of colleagues in Libya just over the last few days to pass on my condolences and get a sense of what they're all trying to do on the ground. So very, very timely and a wonderful initiative, Diego, and a pleasure once again to join you.
Thank you. Well, Peter, first of all, we would like to please ask you to provide us with some essential background to understand this conflict, such as the time framework, the atmosphere in the region, and overall in the Arab world. And also, if you could tell the main parties involved in this mediation process.
Very good. Yeah, so, going back to 2011, when I was a part of the UN standby mediation team, this is an interesting instrument that the UN has. They've been experimenting with it since about 2008, but essentially they recruit people with different expertise every year. And in late 2010, I was recruited to join the team. It was about 5 or 6 people at the time, and the kind of expertise that they're looking for is quite varied. But on our team, we had a 2-star general, a military person who was an expert in security affairs, a constitutional lawyer who understood how to design constitutions and so forth, and legal frameworks within complex settings. And my particular expertise was understanding the steps by which countries go back to constitutional government after they've had a major crisis, which could be, like a civil war, or what we call an unconstitutional change of government, like a coup. We've had 8 in Africa over the last 3 years. What are the steps that they have to take? And so I was recruited onto that team with that expertise that I just built and researched and studied the preceding 20 years. And it's all about, designing a process and getting parties to agree on what that process should be. So it was in that context, when I was recruited and hired, no one had anticipated the Arab Spring at all. So I literally had signed my contract, and you basically, you're on standby and you work from home. You're only required to go in the field if there is a crisis. So when I signed the contract, the world looked very calm. In fact, it looked fantastic. I thought I would spend a year at home doing nothing, and I would still get paid. Okay, best job in the world, right? But of course, the next day the Arab Spring happened, and I think the important thing here is to understand that no one anticipated it, and no one really foresaw it, and so it very quickly spread. Egypt, Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth. And even when Zine El Abidine Ben Ali had gone into exile from Tunisia, and even when Mubarak had fallen, the Libyans themselves did not anticipate that they would have a similar revolution in their country. And it basically happened mainly because Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader at the time, and his son Saif al-Islam made two TV broadcasts to their country. And essentially, Gaddafi threatened his people with violence, and Saif al-Islam did the same. And this was a critical moment in the evolution of what transpired, because until that time, most Libyans would have been quite happy to try and negotiate some kind of broad reform process with Gaddafi and Saif al-Islam. But the nature of those threats, the way that they openly threatened bloodshed, pulled all of the Libyans into the revolutionary camp that was coalescing in the east. And this all happened very quickly, literally in a matter of days. And so Libyans who thought there would be no revolution, including in the diaspora, suddenly realized that a moment had arrived. And without going into too much detail, Gaddafi was carrying forward on his threat to try and destroy the revolutionaries, and had sent columns of tanks moving across the east of the country, bearing down on Benghazi and so forth. In terms of the local stakeholders or the key stakeholders at this particular moment, you have the United Nations, the African Union, you have the Gulf Cooperation Council, you have the League of Arab States, you have NATO, you have the bilateral European countries, like Italy with the oil interests in Libya, French Total, also British Petroleum, and their governments watching very carefully, because Libya, of course, is very oil rich and is a key provider to the global markets. Also, on the regional side, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey were also key stakeholders at this moment. People often get fixated on, the United States or the European players and so forth. But what struck me about what was happening in this rapid time was how important Qatar and the UAE were. And in a way, it was like Qatar had anticipated what was coming much faster than anybody else. And what I'm saying here is that it was Qatar and the UAE who were the first ones to send representatives to the east of the country, and to set up relationships with the rebels, with a view, military support, policy guidance, and so forth. Whereas the European countries were just behind them, and the United States was actually very much in the background, and was not playing a key role. So in that environment, you have this tremendous uncertainty. You have the broader regional impact of the Arab Spring happening, and different countries jockeying to respond to that, and the drama of the moment, quite unusually, was being played out on the UN Security Council floor, of how to respond to this, and the African Union representatives, the European representatives, all of these other stakeholders were actively feeding into a process in New York, where no one had was fully in control or had the full levers, but where everyone's sort of struggling to anticipate the future and to work out what would be the most appropriate response in circumstances where Gaddafi had promised the annihilation of the rebels in the east, and where his tanks were storming down the highway, literally, and the people were starting to die in the fighting already. So, in one sense, we have you can paint a compelling picture of the UN and the UN Security Council actually doing what they're meant to do, which is to respond to a particular crisis, get a common consensus, deliberate Security Council resolutions, and then spring into action to save the rebels in the east, stop the annihilation, and then the question then becomes, okay, what happens next? And it's in that context that the idea of a UN mediation team to negotiate between the rebels and Gaddafi, that's where it is born. And it's in that context where the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, selected a UN mediator, a man, a former foreign minister from Jordan, Abdul Ilah Al-Khatib, and where, as part of his team, he went to the UN standby mediation team and asked specifically, for someone with experience in the region, who had some linguistic capabilities, but who also understood the process of negotiating returns to constitutional government in moments of crisis. So it was in that context that I was joining Abdul Ilah's team, went with him to Benghazi, and he decided that I would become his liaison and interlocutor, dealing exclusively with the rebels in Benghazi on the ground to work out what their negotiating positions were or potentially could be if there was to be a negotiated solution to the crisis with Gaddafi in Tripoli. And so Abdul Ilah Al-Khatib, in addition to flying to Tripoli, dealing with Gaddafi, coming to Benghazi, working with me, was also having to navigate the European Union, the African Union, the regional states through the League of Arab States, the Gulf Cooperation Council with the Saudis, Qatar, and all the rest of it, and trying to get from them a common position and consensus on what where does this end and what does it look like. So it's a very fast-moving and complicated process, and one of the consequences of one of the UN Security Council resolutions was the enabling of a military force under a NATO banner to actually stop Gaddafi's tanks from taking over and destroying the east. That side of it worked quite well and was very effective, and achieved its first objective of stopping the fighting. I'll just leave it there for now, and to pick up the next question.
All right.
And I'm anticipating that you'll have some very good questions as well at the end.
All right, thank you. So now that we have this background, I would like to ask you about the UN first steps at this mediation process. Okay, we have the UN. What is the main goal, the number one priority when you arrive there?
So the first thing I wanted to understand was the legitimacy and the vision of the rebels. I'm calling them the rebels just for simplicity's sake, but they actually had a formal name. They were the National Transitional Council. They claimed to represent all of Libya against Gaddafi. And by and large, I would agree that they had the support of many people in the country. So the first thing is, like, are they really, can they claim to represent their people, right? Because if they're going to commit to any position, can they deliver their people behind them, and can they keep any agreement that they have? So and then separate to that, it's like, well, okay, what are your demands, or what is it that you want to see in the new Libya, and in particular, what kind of role is there for people like Gaddafi, and so forth. And this is in a context where the battlefield results are not clear. There's a stalemate. They're divided. Control of Libya is divided into, what are the full range of possibilities in circumstances where neither side is thought to be able to defeat the other side. So there's not going to be a military victory in this circumstance. This is how the scenario began. What is the possibility here? And so what happens in this moment is the rebels are very they're scared of Gaddafi. They actually, they've been living under him for 42 years. They've seen what he's done. And they initially they don't want any role for Gaddafi in the future of the country at all, nor for his son Saif al-Islam, nor for his family, because they fear that if Gaddafi is allowed to remain in power and in office, then he will eventually outsmart the Libyans and the international community and come for them and kill them. This is a very common held belief and position. And so we say, well, okay, if you're not going to accept Gaddafi, then what kind of transitional governance arrangements are you willing to accept? Who can actually run the country if you won't accept Gaddafi? And then they have to go, well, okay, well, what's the range of possibilities moving forward? The same conversations are happening in Tripoli with Gaddafi and his family, right? And also some of the intelligence chiefs there. And so here we hit a classic dilemma in any kind of mediation is, in this type of mediation is, how do you actually negotiate with someone like Gaddafi? So you have a figure who identifies himself with the state. He believes he is the state, and without him, there is no state. And he was the original revolutionary when he overthrew King Idris in 1969. And he's had his own revolution. And then who are these people who are questioning his power? And so in Gaddafi's mind, he can't believe what he's seeing. And he thinks this is a conspiracy that's been dreamt up from outside. It's not, all he has to do is stay strong and he's going to prevail. But also, there's also an eccentricity about Gaddafi that makes him really, really different to other global leaders. And there's one, perhaps a contemporary example here is the Houthi in Yemen. And so like the Houthi in Yemen, who are very self-contained and whose political world is inside Yemen, and like Gaddafi, there are very little incentives that you can use to change their behavior. So Gaddafi doesn't care about sanctions. He doesn't care about villas in Paris or properties in New York or Los Angeles, or his whole world is inside Libya, and that's by design. So like the Houthi in Yemen, sanctions, any kind of international constraints are just meaningless. So how do you change that and that's extremely difficult, because no one has worked out how to do that. They didn't work out how to do it with Gaddafi, and they didn't work out how to do it with till now with the Houthi, really. So what Abdullah Al-Khatib spent a lot of his time doing was trying to either work out ways in which he could convince Gaddafi that he had to either step down, or if he wouldn't step down, would he be willing to share power in some way, which would allow participation from the rebels and other elements to manage a transition that would more closely, and at the end of which would result in some kind of outcome broadly representative of the will of the Libyan people. So when we look at all of the competing attempts at mediation or parallel efforts who are actually also trying to help in some way what Abdullah is trying to do, they're all trying to solve this problem of convincing Gaddafi to step down or to change his mind. Whether this was Jacob Zuma, the South African leader, whether it was representatives from Russia, whether it was the Norwegians and others. So this becomes a key element in all discussions with all the parties. What role for Gaddafi? And then, if no Gaddafi, what kind of transitional governance arrangement and process and timeline, etc. And this is a dry. I know there's one more thing to press here, which is, so there are external stakeholders who believe that Gaddafi will never negotiate, and so what do? They end up pouring all of their energies into assisting the military capabilities of the rebels. Yeah. And in parallel, this military activity starts to build up in a very discoordinate way, not very united, where Qatar is supporting some elements, UAE is supporting some elements, the French are supporting some elements, and so on and so forth. But and this pressure is sort of mounting in this context of mediation. So as I'll leave that there for that. That's the kernel of the problem, is this figure of Gaddafi, and what do you do?
So, perfect. So taking into account these positions, I have the feeling that you probably felt that the mediation was doomed to failure, maybe from the very beginning, no? You have the rebels insisting on the fact that Gaddafi has to leave, and Gaddafi that is refusing to leave. So do you think that this was the reason why the UN Security Council took resolution 1973 and the NATO and all the forces entered into the country?
Those enabling UN Security Council resolutions were passed very quickly, and only weeks apart. So I would say that the intent and the spirit of the resolutions was actually quite clear in the context of try and get a mediated end to the conflict, while protecting the people of Libya and the rebels in the east from annihilation by Gaddafi. That's the point of departure. So it's only after time goes on, as the real difficulty of breaking this problem, a circuit breaker for what I described and you asked, does the military option in a way start to grow? And yes, to be sure, but I was always quite pessimistic in some ways that we could make Gaddafi change, but at the same time, there are ongoing conversations with people close to Gaddafi in Tripoli, behind the scenes, with different stakeholders who are basically talking about, we are working in Tripoli against Gaddafi. We will support a transition. We want a peaceful outcome here, and so the options never disappear. There's always a potential game plan on the horizon. Again, in a context where people were still not confident that the military option would succeed. And I want to be very clear. I'm not. I wasn't working on the military option. I wasn't part of that. I was aware of what was going on, but we knew that we could already begin to anticipate what some of the challenges Libya would face even before the rebels took Tripoli.
All right. Thank you so much. So we see that the mediation effort isn't getting the results, and the military option is seen as the best resolution to the problem by the Western countries. And we arrive, and in a matter of months, we see that Tripoli falls in August of 2011, and Gaddafi dies. opening a new stage for the UN. The UN become something like a supportive role in the regime's political transition with the establishment of the UN mission in Libya. How do you see these events? How do you feel it from the mediation team?
Yeah, so I just want to emphasize again the centrality of Qatar and the UAE and Turkey in the events that unfolded in 2011. So it's not just the West. It's not just NATO has a specific role, and under that NATO umbrella is Turkey, UAE, and Qatar. Right? They're actually providing planes and so forth as part of that mandate. So when Tripoli falls, it's the Qataris and it's the UAE and Turkey, which are very visible, very present, and extremely influential with the Libyan factions. And in a way, the sort of the West kind of those Western countries, they sort of step back a little bit, and you're absolutely right. The UN gets a central role, and to oversee and steer the Libyan transition. And then this is done under initially a man called Ian Martin, and then subsequent UN SRSGs. So while I remain engaged, I go to Tripoli on the first plane after it's fallen to the rebels. I'm dealing with my contacts there for a couple more months. But in effect, you have in theory, a political transition that's being overseen by the UN, fairly traditional type of role. And at this particular moment, and indeed, I would argue for the subsequent, well, at least the first 12, 18 months, Libyans are overjoyed at the outcome, and as fighting stops, they're supporting the process by which the UN is organising elections so that Libyans can have a legitimate elected transitional government working on their behalf. And even people who have been, working on Libya for decades and have careers out of academic and otherwise, are writing quite remarkable pieces in like Foreign Affairs and other journals saying, "Wow, this has turned out to be a complete surprise. It's gone really well. We did not anticipate that a country like Libya, which has had 42 years of autocratic rule, could suddenly kind of embrace a political process, bury the hatchet, and it looked like it was going to work out very, very well indeed against the historical record, frankly." So one really big learning point out of this for everybody that I want to get in now is when countries have had autocratic rule for such a long period under a system like Gaddafi created, they're actually very poorly placed to manage normal discursive processes around representative government elections and so forth. So the example I try and give everyone is, just imagine if tomorrow North Korea collapsed. What would happen? Well, what I can tell you right now is that there's not a single North Korean who would know what to do. Right? This is the sort of this is what Libya was facing, and it really was a unique situation. So people were surprised. Basically, the population stood back and were very accommodating of what their leaders were trying to do. And this starts to change though after the first 12, 14 months in a very, very bad way. When the Libyans start to confront the question of, okay, how do we deal with transitional justice questions, and how do we deal with what role do we allow for Libyan bureaucrats and civil servants and police and security forces who got rich under Gaddafi, or who were in positions of power under Gaddafi, and who had committed crimes against the people. And so this issue was, a central dynamic where some of the Libyans wanted revenge against these people, and others said, no, we need to understand that these bureaucrats, these security people, these ambassadors, these diplomats, they're Libyans like us. We should give them a role in the future running of the country, and we'll choose a few select cases where people have blood on their hands or got obscenely wealthy, who have to go through a judicial process. Now, a lot of the rebels and revolutionaries, especially the younger Libyans, were very convinced in getting rid of all this former class of people. They started to interfere in the political process and weapons into the parliament building. I'm not sure what's going on in the sound. Are you getting that as well?
Sorry?
Is the sound coming through still?
No, the sound is perfect.
Okay, very good. Sorry, I was getting some feedback. I wasn't sure. All right, so this is so they come down to negotiate this legislation called the Political Isolation Law, and this basically removes everyone at a certain level under the Getafe administration from any future role in the country for 10 years. It's very punitive. It's a terrible law because many people who hadn't done anything wrong other than do their job were suddenly lost their job or forced to leave the country. And this is happening in parallel where you have an underground assassination assassinations happening. Starts in the east of the country, but where some of the revolutionaries are actually targeting these former security chiefs and these former representatives. And they kill about 300 people, key leaders and key representatives. So the combination of the law and this assassination campaign meant that actually, Libya's only got about 5-6 million people. Hundreds of thousands of Libyans left the country because they felt they had no future role. And it's in this moment that we see the former security elements trying to defend themselves in response to this campaign. This is what ends up dividing the country and leading to two governments in the east and the west. And it's in this moment, so we have a quite healthy first year, and then by the second year, the thing starts to fall apart. And all of the external stakeholders, including the UN and including Turkey and Qatar and UAE and so forth, are very poorly placed to try and mediate between, to stop the Libyans from passing this crazy law, and to deal with the actual assassinations which are happening on a daily basis. And this is because it's happening. A lot of it's happening behind the scenes, this is the key essential part of why Libya has got to the point of being a divided country to this very day, I would argue.
All right. Okay. So for wrapping up, because we have to pass to the question turn, I would like to ask you if you could summarize what would you say were the main findings and lessons to be learned for future mediation efforts carried by the UN. What did you learn from this whole process?
Yeah, fantastic. So they're really important big questions, and I think for me the biggest one is that we always talk about the importance of context and the local dynamics and making sure that we respond to those in a thoughtful, targeted manner. And I knew immediately when I got to Libya that this country was different to every other country I'd ever worked in. And I kept trying to tell everybody, look, this is North Korea. This is not Tunisia. This is not Egypt. This is not some North African country or sub-Saharan country, or it's in a different place, in a different space to everywhere else. And the Libyan, the muscle tissue of government and basic administration and so on was missing under the system that Getafe had created, which was a form of direct democracy between the people and himself. There was no intermediary institutions like, parliaments or courts and so forth. They were there on paper, but they were not doing their job. So every Libyan saw himself as it was very equal, and there was no one. Libyans found it very hard to appoint people who could represent them and to commit to agreements that they had made, because they were just very poorly placed and trained in this kind of discursive activity. And so for me, I was like, when we think about processes by which countries, they have civil war or some other crisis, and they go back to some kind of stable arrangement, we have a number of mechanisms that are quite common to all. And so, transitional government, you need to have a transitional government, you need to have a conversation about the future structure of your government, you need to talk about transitional justice questions and so on. But this was a kind of series of activities that were completely alien to the Libyan people. So I think what I'm trying to say here is we did not give enough thought to coming up with alternatives that were more suitable and accessible. So what would be some of the possibilities, innovations that could have happened in this context, where frankly, when the rebels took control of Libya, Tripoli, and then the country, this was a surprise even to them. They didn't anticipate the rapid collapse of the central government, and so they come in and they take charge, and they literally have been fighting, and then they've got control of the country. What could one do in that circumstance? So this, and what I'm going to offer is just from long conversations with Libyans. What they would have liked to have seen is much greater control over the oil and gas revenues, by which the Libyans themselves would have more carefully organised the flow of monies to the militias and the different military groups that had emerged after the fall, and so really thoughtful economic statecraft. Cutting people off from the payroll immediately, taking their guns off them. Really grabbing hold of this very loose security coalition straight away from the very beginning. And so no one did that, and partly nobody did it because the Libyans weren't asking for it. Some Libyans were. Some Libyans were saying, we've got to get a hold of this, and UN and everyone else moved too slowly. So that's a really big issue. The other thing that I think is important is the and this again is coming from Libyans, is that you essentially would have aimed, rather than going for a top-down approach with reforming a big central government and working for control of the country in that regard, take a decentralized approach and work through the major cities. Basically, 90% of Libyans live on the coast by the Mediterranean. They have very strong regional and city identification, whether it's Tripoli, Misrata, Benghazi, Derna, and so forth. So instead of focusing just on Tripoli and top down, then really much stronger presence in a decentralized manner, really focusing on local governance and preventing groups from going from one jurisdiction to another. So you essentially lower the cost of the prize in the centre of Tripoli. So I think on that, recognise the real differences. Think about you've got to move so fast on the security file, and you've got to really go in a decentralised manner. Otherwise, you're just going to repeat a formula that doesn't apply.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for the talk. Yeah.
Round of applause.
Now we're all right. So now we are going to start with the questions. If anyone wants to start, just raise your hand and we'll pass the mic. All right. So I don't know if you want to start. If no, we can start. ¿No? Ah, vale. Voy a pasar el micrófono.
¿Sí? ¿Se nos ve? Sí.
Can you see us?
Can you see us, Peter?
I can see.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much for being here, Professor Bartu. Diego's last question, I think it was a very interesting, and so was your answer. And your answer prompted a thought in me, and this is that I'm sure someone here in our audience dreams about working in the UN or in some international organization like this one. And the thought was, the idea was, should we be making experts, like scholars, regional experts, and not generalists? Because at the end of the day, we're all studying international relations, which is such a broad arrangement of different things. And yeah, what do you think about this?
Yeah, very good. That's a great question. So my entry point into the United Nations was because of my regional expertise. So I started off, because I'm Australian, I started off with a strong interest in Southeast Asia, and I spoke Indonesian and I spoke Cambodian or Khmer, and so when the UN had a big mission at the end of the Cold War overseeing a political transition in Cambodia, I got hired as the assistant to the UN chief because I spoke Cambodian and I could speak Khmer, and that was the main reason. I mean, I had some diplomatic experience, but I was, it was really the regional expertise. So that is a very that's an important entry point into both any a foreign ministry or international organization. And it's actually very important in my view. But the other thing that I sort of encourage students here to think about too is, have a language, be a generalist in undergrad, but when you go into your master's degree, you want to think in a bit more of a vocational manner. So you'll get a seat at the table, if you're a human rights specialist or you're an election administration specialist or you're someone who understands community responses to climate change or development issues. Even better if you can speak the language, but you want to have a skill set that you can. This is not to say that generalists, there is a role for generalists as well, but generalists tend to have very good skills also. How to deal with difficult clients, how to deal with complex processes with many different stakeholders with different positions. How do you actually, those mediation and those what we call soft skills are actually incredibly important. So in all of this, my advice is I don't see many people who've gone into academic careers going into the field to do this kind of work. They often get called upon for their regional expertise and what they can offer and advice and so forth. But the practitioners, the ones who are applying this, are not the theorists. They're the ones who've been able to get, usually through luck, as much field experience as possible. So you want to be even if you're working for an NGO in some really difficult part of Africa, you're usually getting a lot more experience in that environment than operational experience than if you're doing an internship in your foreign ministry in your capital. I like to emphasize the operational side of things because I think it's really important. These are possibilities, I think, to think of.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that was a helpful answer. I think we have another question.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask is that you have mentioned that one of the main reasons that the Libyan crisis ended up the way that it did was the fact that the rebel forces were highly decentralized, which eventually led to big problems in the post-Gaddafi state building. So what I wanted to ask regarding this was that is it possible that in this rebel coalition, many of these forces, many of these militias, were not in reality defending any kind of democratic project for Libya, but instead just wanted to topple Gaddafi's dictatorship in order to establish their own power. And also here I would like to emphasize, since we are talking about the Arab Spring, something similar happened in the Syrian civil war, where the rebel side also happened to be a broad coalition of different militias. Many of them later would join forces with ISIS or Al Qaeda. So what I wanted to ask is that was it really possible a democratic project in the Arab world from a revolutionary way? Was it really did it really have any true realistic perspectives, or was it doomed to fail?
Fantastic. This is the one of the great existential questions, I think. Let me give you what my thoughts on it. There are many, of course. So I think that just broadly the Arab Spring and what's happened subsequently in the region, in my view, it hasn't actually finished. Right. So we had another series of uprisings in 2019, one in Lebanon, one in Sudan, and other uprisings in Iraq, which overthrew the government then, and so forth. So the issues that animated or created the Arab Spring in the first place, everything from dysfunctional government to lack of affordable housing to no employment opportunities, corruption, and so forth, they're all still there. And they haven't gone away. So the young population are acutely aware of this, and they're thinking about ways in which they can mobilize, in the future if the opportunity arises. They're either doing that, or they're hopping on boats and migrating illegally across the Mediterranean, as you all know, because they've given up faith and hope in their governments ever changing. And that's massive tragedy. But the Arab Spring itself has not gone away, and for all of its discontents and where things are at right now, the way I look at this is we think of it as a sort of a 3-act drama, like a play. We're halfway through the second act. There's a third act. We've had the prologue and the first act. We're halfway through the second act. The third act is coming. So that's just where I sit on these questions. The interesting one about what form of government would be the most stable or the most suitable in any breakthroughs that may happen in the future is a really fantastic one. So if we accept that one of the reasons for the uprisings in the first place was non-responsive government, authoritarian attributes, lack of serious economic credentials, cronyism, and so forth, you've got a kind of clear demonstration of how the authoritarian model has failed to deliver. And so the question then becomes, okay, what other possibilities are there that would provide for at least a greater degree of stability and accommodating the various strands, elements of society, and so forth moving forward. I take a very lukewarm approach to democracy, and the sort of I don't really care what form of government emerges as long as it doesn't kill its people and they get economic opportunities and it's relatively stable, and there's some kind of room for basic mobility, right? So I think the desire for that still is very strong and very clearly there. There are some models that one could imagine that might not perhaps tick all the democratic boxes that we might imagine, but that precisely what form it should take really has to come out of a locally rooted discussion among all of the the various constituents in each country, and so I'm still in continuous conversation with Egyptians and Lebanese and Tunisians and Libyans, Iraqis, Yemenis about what forms this might take, whether more decentralized forms of government as a potential avenue. So we need to. There's still a lot of work on getting the data together that would actually provide compelling cases as to forms of decentralization, regionalization, curtailing the powers of central government, allowing for greater participation and rights and so forth. So all of those issues are part of an ongoing discussion. But so what was it doomed to fail? I would say in no, it wasn't. And I think in each case we look at, we probably don't have the time, but whether it's Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, and all these other countries, we can clearly show where people actually intentionally derailed the democratic project or didn't believe in it, different shades of Islamists had different visions for sure for their respective governments. So that's this idea of political Islam is still something that the region hasn't completely resolved as yet. Although my sense is that the Islamists are currently a much more diminished force than they were even several years ago.
We have another question. Yeah.
Hello. Well, my question is so simple. It's about the United Nations and the countries that were there. And I wanted to ask about why Russia and China did not play a more active role in defending Gaddafi and confront the West in this sense. Thank you.
Great question. So this comes back to the nature of Gaddafi, the man, and basically he had alienated everybody. He had done, for an authoritarian ruler, authoritarian rulers are quite smart, right? They're normally much better at maintaining relationships with countries that have similar mindsets and similar values. But Gaddafi had alienated every single person and every single country to the point where, some of the authoritarian Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and so forth, they hated Gaddafi. And in a way, it was the response of the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis who so quickly condemned Gaddafi at the beginning of the revolution that actually led the Russians and the Chinese to then question their own views here. I think what I'm trying to say is that if the Saudis and the Qataris and Emirates were the first ones to condemn Gaddafi and say he had to go. And they did that because they hated him because Gaddafi was interfering in their own countries and interfering everywhere else in the region. Now, if the Saudis had not done that, if the Emiratis and Qataris had not done that, then I think the Russians and the Chinese would have, played their usual role and stopped in the UN Security Council any kind of collective action in responding to the crisis in early 2011. But what happened was that the Russians and the Chinese were looking at what was unfolding. They saw the threats that Gaddafi was making, and they were also quite hesitant and caught up in the revolution that was spreading across the region. So this is one of these once in a decade global events happening, and they weren't too sure how to place themselves at that particular moment. And so, as a consequence, that's what allowed the Chinese, or it enabled the Chinese and the Russians to actually play, in a way, ironically, a very constructive role in authorizing collective action under the UN Security Council. But I say ironically again, despite this consensus, we see what happened as a consequence has not gone well, to put it mildly. And so what the Chinese and Russians have done subsequently, and this is the ongoing legacy of Libya, is they've gone, never again. We will not step into this space again.
Okay, so thank you, Peter. We've got another last question. If I'm not wrong, we've got 5 minutes. So thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for being here. My question is related to the democracies, mostly in the Arab world. It's not characterized by being really defendants of democracy, and how this is going to be paired with the West values of democracy, liberalism, and how the world order that is in continued changing and the balance is more in favor of these new countries. How are the economic relationships in terms of oil and all these kinds of vital resources that now we are lacking? So how to combine these values with the economic necessity of having the resources for these new technologies? Thank you.
Yeah, this is another fantastic question. So I think the first thing to understand from my perspective is that we have the world is transitioning on many levels in ways that we cannot all fully anticipate. So we have the whole energy question and the energy transition. We have deep dissatisfaction globally, I think, on the ability of governments to respond to the needs of their people. You have a rise in more authoritarian forms of government, and this is not going away. None of these big challenges are going away. And there's also a mad scramble that you mentioned, in terms of trying to find the resources to ideally replace fossil fuels and so forth, which is creating a new set of winners and losers in the global landscape. And you have key countries in the West that had previously been very consistent on many issues that are now becoming very inconsistent. So we had the US presidential election cycle has started already, and we had the first debates by all of the Republican candidates 3 weeks ago, and one of the key contenders said that climate change was a hoax. A billionaire hedge fund owner who's second in the polls has called climate change a hoax. So and there's a real possibility that we may enter a new Trump-like era in terms of the United States, and so people look at that and as kind of more evidence of this growing instability more broadly, where if even the so-called key supporters of a certain value and way of government can't agree and can't find its way, then what else has got to happen? And we see evidence of people responding to this in terms of middle powers and countries which have previously been quietist, less active, and now all seeking to secure their strategic autonomy and resources and so forth. So it's a mad scramble that's happening demonstrably and visibly everywhere. So I mean, all I can say to you is I can't give you the answer to where all this is going. All I can say to you is that you're currently, in my view, living through one of the most exciting times in the last 200 years, and the best way to sort of prepare for it is to have the kind of events you're having right now, and be wary of anybody who tells you the answer, because from where I sit, no one's got it.
Thank you, Peter. And maybe we have time for one last very, very fast question. All right.
Hi, thank you for your conference, Professor. Personally, I find the character of Gaddafi quite fascinating, going from popular hero to megalomaniac dictator and ultimately being toppled by another revolution. So I just wanted to ask you, during the time you were there, how did the Libyan people regard him, what they thought of him, given also that the country experienced considerable economic development during his rule? So did you see anything interesting in what the people thought of him?
Yeah, fantastic. So my sense of Gaddafi's rule is that at least the first 10 years was actually he was very well received, and he had this vision of what he called the Green Revolution, and people kind of look at this and they're very critical and so on. I think we need to look more closely at his genuine appeal and some of the real achievements that he made for the Libyan people. So what's undeniable is, partly as a consequence of the natural resources that Libya has, is that when the Libyan revolution started, Libya was the best country in Africa. Of the 52 countries in Africa, it had the best education standards, the best health standards, the most generous benefits from government, and so forth. Question is, why did they then rise up in those circumstances? But that's sort of another story in a way. But so Gaddafi had some real impact, but I think the issue was that, particularly in the last decade of his life in the 21st century, his abilities, he visibly began to deteriorate. And some people think this is because of the drugs he was taking, the medicines he was on, and he became more and more erratic. And so Libyans were becoming quite embarrassed about Gaddafi. And so whenever they would travel abroad and outside the country and they identified themselves as Libyans, everyone would laugh at them. I mean, everyone in the region was like, "Oh, you're a Libyan, poor you. What a disaster, what a disgrace." But on top of that, his system became more coercive, and really the security apparatus was doing terrible things to different forms. So Libyans really feared Gaddafi, and he had all kinds of tricks that he would pull on people, and he would mock them and undermine them on national radio and TV, and they really didn't feel safe. So I think by the time we get to the revolution in 2011, I said it, at the beginning, people would have much preferred to have a few reforms and no major revolution happened at all. That was the position. But it was only when he came out and he threatened to kill them all and bloodshed and hunt them down like cockroaches that they went, well, what can we do? So once they'd made that decision, they knew they would never be safe again. And this was something that was delivered to me many, many times in many different locations. And so they, in a way, they felt they had no way of going back. So it's what the Gaddafi figure is tragic in the sense that he was someone who actually achieved a lot for his people, but didn't know when to step down and go away. And this is the standard story of authoritarians.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, for all your questions, or for all the talk. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Right. Good luck, everybody. I've got to go to a class at noon, so I'll leave now. But
All right. Good luck with that.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Ole.
Muchas gracias a todos por venir y nada, os esperamos la semana que viene.
Sí.
Sabemos